En la época de nosotros, nos veníamos y nos coleábamos de noche para parcharnos aquí adentro y hacer los pogos. Y esto era de lleno de momias. Y a las 5:30, 6 de la mañana cuando salíamos, aquí en la calle de Niquitao, habían 5, 6 muertos o hasta más. Parcero, era una regonorrea, uno tener que caminar como si los muertos fueran piedras, una gonorrea.
Callejones de la Ciudad Podrida, alleyways in the rotten city. A journey along the living memory of Medellin punk scene, the Punk Medallo scene, and the local, national, and global context where it has developed. Our voice, building up our memory. Hello, everybody. This is the second episode of Callejones de la Ciudad Podrida, alleyways in the rotten city. In this second episode, we're going to start talking about the actual punk scene, the Punk Medallo scene. In the first episode, we discussed some issues related to the background that has surrounded the emergence of the punk scene in Medellin. We mentioned some specific moments. For example, the first moment, the arrival of rock and roll in the city, which was in the middle of dictatorship. Then how rock and roll was embraced by the cultural industries, by the radio stations, by the TV stations and everything. And it became a very important thing in the mainstream culture. But it never became the most important thing, because there were also tropical bands, which have traditionally been the mainstream culture in the city. Then, in the 71, there was a big festival. It was, for many people, it had been associated with the Colombian Woodstock. It was called Ancon because it was made in a municipality in very close to Medellin, but in some lands that were a property of the city of Medellin. That is why the mayor was forced to quit after that festival, and it became a very important breakup between the rock and roll scene and the mainstream culture. So from that moment on, rock and roll went underground. The whole 70s were basically that, an underground scene. Some people were getting some music by mail and everything. They were passing it like informally from friends to friends. Some gangs started developing and stuff like that. And there were some radio stations that were a little bit friendly to rock and roll, and they had some shows where rock and roll had a space. But it was basically something based on shows and specific programs, but it was not whole radio stations dedicated to rock and roll in the 70s. In the 80s, then a new scene started developing. Then some record labels became interested in some rock and roll groups. The scene was more centered in a kind of music that was a little bit heavier. There was the rockero scene, which is what we had back then. There weren't different scenes, but there was one big rock and roll scene. There was a division between two sides of this rockero scene. One side was called the caspa, or the casposo side. It was like the caspa is dandruff, and it is a generic name for the commercial approach on rock and roll, and it was specifically associated with radio rock and roll, the rock and roll that was being played on the radio. And then you had the other kind of rock and roll, which was like heavy rock, you could say, or like underground rock. And it grouped different kinds of rock. You had the metal scene, you had the headbangers, you had the punk scene, and you had something that was generically referred to as vieja guardia, old guard. Vieja guardia groups some different forms of rock and roll that prevailed in the 60s and the 70s, like psychedelic rock, like the early forms of heavy metal, hard rock, glam rock, and different kinds of rock, a little bit of progressive rock, and different forms of rock. So these three, vieja guardia, metal, and punk included hardcore, were what we could call the underground scene. And there was a very specific moment, which is the final moment in our first episode, and it was the Battle of the Bands, a big festival that took place in 1985, La Batalla de las Bandas. In this festival, there was a big battle. It was literally a battle, and there was like some kind of an official ceremony of a breakup between the mainstream rock and roll and underground rock. And after that, the punk rock scene started developing, which is what we're going to discuss today. Well, some of the first elements that we need to consider when we think about that further development of the scene was galladas, notas, and parches. Galladas were gangs, you could say. They were groups of people interested in something. They had a very territorial base, but they were also interested frequently in rock and roll. Some of them became only punk galladas. There were some rockero galladas that included people who were interested in all these different forms of rock and roll. But then, as of 1985 or something like that, some new kinds of gangs started emerging, which were the punk galladas. It is also important to consider notas, which were parties, you could say, rock and roll parties. In these parties, people would bring their own records, like the attendants would bring their own records, and there would be somebody, like the person or the gallada organizing the nota, who would be in charge of the sound system. So they would be playing everybody's records, and they would bring their own records as well. So these were very important places for the socialization of the scene, and for new punks and new headbangers to meet other rockers. And you had the parches as well. The parches were the places where the galladas would hang out. So they would usually take a corner or take a field, a baseball, a football field, a soccer field, or something like that. Maybe some multi-sports courts that you can find in some neighborhoods were used by these gangs to hang out. So these were the parches. Parches could sometimes refer to the places, parches could sometimes refer to the gangs, or parche could sometimes refer to the activities that you could be involved in. So now we're learning some of the vocabulary here in the scene. Well, galladas had a problem. It was that they were very territorial. They were based on territorial issues. So very frequently, the people who were members of the same gallada were people who would study at the same school or who would live in the same neighborhood or stuff like that. But this territorial nature helped these galladas develop tensions with other galladas. So there were frequently fights, and there were some differences between them. And differences would sometimes revolve around the fact that there wasn't much information about what being a punk or what being a headbanger was, because as we discussed in the first episode, rockers were in the middle of were basically stigmatized back then. They didn't rock and roll was not part of the mainstream culture. Rock and roll was always something peripheral. And after Ancon, rockers had been basically stigmatized. So it meant that there wasn't much access to, for example, musical instruments associated with rock and roll, or there wasn't much access to information associated to rock and roll because the mainstream culture didn't stimulate that access to the rock and roll culture. So these different interpretations of what it meant to be a punk generated tensions between the galladas. Apart from that, some important things that or some characteristics that would be very evident, that would become very evident in that first scene, was the hegemonic idea of masculinity around which it had developed. It was a deeply sexist and homophobic scene, but we will discuss that later on in a little bit more detail. And there were also episodes of racism. One important thing to understand at this point in terms of the presence of women is that they faced twice the barriers that the rest of rockers faced when they wanted to enter the scene. There were some barriers that were very important to keep the scene from being accessed by casposos. So these barriers included the fact that you didn't have access to the most difficult music to get, the most scarce music or everything, because they wouldn't lend it to you unless you proved your worth inside the scene. So everybody had to pass through those rituals, but women had to pass through some extra rituals, as due to their very nature as women, they were suspicious of not being committed enough, or of not being strong enough as to be welcome in the scene. So it was very difficult for them to enter. It was so difficult that back in the 80s, only 2 bands had female members. They were SS Ultimatum and Crimen Impune. So that gives us an idea of how difficult it was for women to be part of the scene. Apart from that, there are many stories of episodes of violence against women. They were abused, they were raped in some occasions. And there were many different kinds of violence, not only this kind of sexual violence, but also symbolic and other kinds of violence that were very important. And anyway, women found ways to prevail that will be important as we go along this story. Okay, so we were talking about galladas, about parches, about notas, and about all these things that help the scene develop. This territorial character of the scene was very important, especially in the northwestern area of the city, because that was the main epicenter of punk. In the northeastern slope, there were lots of rockers, but the scene was a little different. What prevailed there was a mix between punk and metal. So that is why that other slope of the valley was very important in the development of the hardcore scene. But we will discuss that later. So you had the first notas that were exclusively punk, and then you had these first concerts after the first notas. In the concerts, we were talking about the one that took place in Buenos Aires. The church was being repaired, so some punks who lived around there saw that the church was not being used for the usual religious services, and they decided to go and talk to the priest and ask him if he could rent them the building to do a concert there. They didn't tell him that they were punks. They didn't mention punk rock at all. They talked about some youth groups, and they talked about some cultural activities that they wanted to do with the community and whatsoever. And the priest was happy to help them and to rent the church to them. But then the day of the concert, when he saw all these crazy guys there, all these punks and all these headbangers and everything, he went crazy, and he became really, really scared, and he called the police. He called the police, and he told them that they had been seized by the ELN, the guerrilla. And, of course, when the police came, they were not friendly at all. They arrived with their guns in their hands, and they started shooting everybody. It was all hell broke loose. But fortunately, they found ways to escape and everything. Many of them went to jail that day, and it was terrible. But that's how the first concerts developed. Another concert, I think it was in Copacabana, even had a dead guy there at the entrance. Somebody got shot there, And they knew that if they called the police and they told them about a dead person in the concert and everything, they would come and they would finish the concert. And since they were such unusual events, they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to risk finishing it. So they never told anybody, and this concert developed with a corpse in the middle of the dance floor, which was like a very spooky thing. But, well, that's how it was in those days. An important event that that we should mention now is the making of the movie Rodrigo D. No Futuro. Rodrigo D was shot. They started shooting it in 1986. It opened in 1990. It took some time for them to finish it. In those first days, when they started shooting it, and when they started the research before shooting it, they started speaking to people and they started walking around, finding locations and everything. They knew the areas of the city where they wanted to shoot it, and they started going there and visiting, the scouting there. And as they started visiting this area, they noticed that there were that punks and gang members sometimes had some interactions, and sometimes they were friends with each other and everything. So that was the image. That's how they portrayed the scene in that movie, and this was the tricky and the troublesome thing about it. For many people, it was very controversial to show punks as close to gang members, especially in those days, because now we were in the middle of war with the Medellin cartel. That war started 1985. Well, I think it's important to do a parenthesis here and to kind of revisit what the war against the Medellin cartel was. As we said in the first episode, Medellin had a very important industrial development in the first half of the century, of the 20th century. This development was basically centered in the textile industry. That was the main industry. In the mid-century, in the mid-20th century, there were problems because the country was in the middle of a civil war. We were in a dictatorship, so many people were fleeing from their lands in the rural areas of Colombia, and they were coming to the cities. So in something like 10 years or something like that, Medellin almost doubled its population between the 40s and the 60s. And there was no city planning that could handle that situation. So it became a very difficult thing. As of the 1950s, the shanty towns started growing, and they became a big problem in the city. They were called tugurios here. And they became a problem for the administrations. And also, another important thing is that the communities in those shanty towns started developing after their own principles, after their own values, and after their own interests, of course. And very frequently, these interests were going in the opposite direction to the interests of the main culture. They were invading some lands, they were invading some territories to start these new neighborhoods, but there were some owners of those lands, some owners of those territories. So, of course, there were tensions between them. These tensions led the communities to be very strong in their logics and their practices of self-organization. And they started developing their own territories. These practices included, for example, practices of self-defense, because very frequently the authorities, the administration, the police, and even the army would come to try to kick them out, and they had to defend themselves. And we will see that this had an evolution that we will discuss later. These shanty towns started developing, and this crisis led to a big economic and generalized crisis in Medellin. In the 1970s, unemployment was on the rise, and the industrial activity was in a big crisis. The commercial activity associated with this industrial activity was of course also in a big crisis. Then some new practices started developing, started emerging, associated especially with smuggling. So this smuggling, especially of cigarettes, liquor, some things associated with the textile industry, all of these kinds of smuggling became or made the crisis deeper. And then one specific kind of smuggling became more important. It was drug smuggling. At first, the main drug that was smuggled from Colombia was marijuana. It was the traffic of marijuana was associated with something they call la fiebre marimbera, or the weed fever, if you want. It was in the 1970s, and it was basically centered in the Caribbean coast. But then in the 1980s, a new trend started developing, and it was the cocaine trade. In that cocaine trade, Medellin was more important. And then something called Medellin cartel started growing. It included people from other places, from Bogota or from the coffee planting areas of Caldas, Quindío, Risaralda, and so on. But anyway, Medellin was a very important epicenter for this in this story. So one of the most important people in the Medellin cartel started gaining a lot of recognition. It was Pablo Escobar. He became so important at a specific moment that he became interested in entering politics. So he entered the Liberal Party. He was part of the Liberal Party, and at a certain moment he even got to the Congress. So his political career was ascending, and he was very, very interested in it. But there was a certain area of the Liberal Party, especially something called the New Liberalism, that started criticizing not only him, but everything that they call dineros calientes. Dineros calientes were basically money associated with drug trafficking and involved in politics. So they started denouncing that on the media, and Pablo Escobar didn't like it. So he killed the Minister of Justice at that moment, who was part of this trend of liberalism. His name was Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. He was killed in 1984. So after this assassination, an all-out war between the state and the Medellin cartel started. So there were punks in Medellin before that moment. And the first moments of that war were not really very associated with the poorest neighborhoods of the city. That kind of violence started growing as the decade evolved. But at first it was not so central. I think it is not correct to say that the punk scene, the Punk Medallo scene, was born from drug trafficking. But it became a very important thing as it developed later on. Well, so after this parenthesis, let's go back to Rodrigo D, the movie. In this movie, the center was gangs associated with organized crime. These gangs and the members of these gangs had very close relation and interactions with punks in the movie. So this was very controversial for many people, not only in the scene, but outside it. So it helped to increase that stigma that was associated with punks. Because if first rockers were associated with immorality and with excess and with certain behaviors that were not acceptable for the mainstream culture in Medellin, now they were also associated with violent behaviors. And saying violence in Medellin was not only violence as vandalism or something like this, but at that moment was basically associated with being a member of a gang. And gangs were basically associated with drug dealing. And there was something important. In the end, by the late 80s, 1980s, Pablo Escobar, in the middle of that war, he offered to pay people who would kill police officers. He offered different amount of monies depending on the rank of the officers, and that made things a lot worse because many cops were killed, but also many young people were targeted after that by the police. The police would just go as dressed as civilians, wearing ski masks at night, and do massacres in the poorest neighborhoods. Massacres of kids, groups of kids who were hanging out at a corner, just supposing that they could be associated with organized crimes, and they could maybe go and try to kill them the day after. Okay, so Rodrigo D started shooting in 1986. They started talking to the people in the neighborhoods, with young people, with trying to learn a little bit about how life was in those popular neighborhoods to build their story. And as they did that, they started talking to bands as well. They decided to do some auditions. They decided to audition some of the bands in the northern areas of the city to see who would take part in the soundtrack of the movie. And they did. They rented a studio for 2 days, and they auditioned as many bands as they could, and they recorded some songs. They passed this cassette to the punks who attended the recording sessions, and this cassette became the first compilation of punk in Medellin. It was an accidental compilation. It was not planned. There was no album cover. There was no list of songs. You didn't know the names of the bands. Nothing was clear about it. It was just a tape. And this tape started passing around from hand to hand, from punk to punk. And it became the first compilation. It was simply called or referred to as Punk Medallo. And it became almost a legend. Later, in 2003, some guys from Castilla did a version of this first compilation, an extended version in CD. They included all the songs that had been included in that first tape. They also included some rehearsals and some songs by other bands that were important between 1985 and 1993, more or less. And this new version, this extended version, had 3 CDs. You can find it in YouTube if you want to check it out. Well, so the movie, they were making the movie, all these bands recorded that compilation, it started circulating and everything, but then there was a second moment. At that second moment, they wanted to record a formal record. So they started calling the bands again, and many of the bands didn't want to take part in that second part of the project because they considered it to be caspa, dandruff, that name that they used for anything that was not associated with the underground ethos of punk. Probably one of the reasons is that the punk scene was always very skeptical about the participation of people who were not members of the scene. So if people from the administration or people from the academy or people from some other kinds of institutions would come to their territories, they were always skeptical and they would not be very friendly when it came to interacting with them. Some people who participated in the shooting of Rodrigo D, for example, mentioned that they would go to some of the concerts in those days or to some of the notas and parches, and they would bring their cameras. But then at the end of the party, some punks would come to them and they would force them to give them the tapes, any recording and anything that they could have. So that is why it is very difficult to have access to any of these first recordings. They are not easy to find. And besides that, many of the members of those bands and many of those first punks were not very fond of having their faces photographed or recorded in a video or anything like that. Even to this day, I mean, it was during my research, during the field work, it was very difficult sometimes to have interviews with these old school punks. They still keep that skepticism. Well, another important event that took place in those days, 1987, more or less, was the arrival of fanzines. Fanzines are handmade magazines, usually made by fans themselves, by punk rock fans, and they were usually associated with photocopies and stuff like that. And they have very particular aesthetics. There was a magazine first called Visión Rockera, Rocker Vision, but this magazine had a very different kind of aesthetics. It was not close to that of fanzines. Fanzines started arriving more or less in 1987 or something like that. The first scene report from the Medellin punk scene that appeared in the Maximum Rock and Roll magazine in San Francisco was in 1987. So I think it is possible to deduce from that we didn't have much access to fanzines before, because that was one of the first sources. I mean, in that fanzine you can find the address of punk rockers all over the world that were the contacts that the local punks started building. So it is possible to, or it is easy to suppose that fanzines started arriving more or less in 1987. You can see the change in the aesthetics of the publications, the new publications such as Subterráneo Medellin, or such as Nueva Fuerza, or others, or Módulo X21 and others that would come later. They had some elements in common. For example, they had the scene reports that showed the interchange of mail with people from other local scenes around the world, and they also included addresses, mail addresses, for the people to write to punks all over the world, and those were very important things for the scene. So that is another important element, the arrival of fanzines in 1987, and then the emergence of lots of different local fanzines. Some fanzines that is important to mention here include Visión Rockera, include Nueva Fuerza, include Despelote, include Módulo X21, include Alternativa, include Subterráneo Medellin, and many others. There were many fanzines. So information started coming. And this first situation of the galladas having to basically invent the codes that defined their identity as punks, this first moment was basically over, because now it was possible to have access and to be better informed about what it meant to be a punk, as this interchange with scenes around the world started growing. One important thing to mention here is that there was another character that started emerging at that moment. It was the lone punk. There were some punks that were not members of gangs, of galladas. The punks who were members of galladas were the ones living specifically in the northern areas of the city. But punks from the south were not like that. They didn't have a gallada, they didn't have a gang. And they would go from gang to gang, they would circulate, and they would also help the music to circulate. They were very important because very frequently there were tensions between the members of different gangs. So these tensions avoided the circulation of punk rock material. But the lone punks who would easily circulate from one gang to the other were an important element in the development of the scene, of the citywide scene that was the next stage. Well, an important element in the development of the scene, especially in that direction of becoming a citywide scene, going from being centered in the gangs, in the galladas, to becoming something that was citywide. An important step was MPM. It was an organization. MPM stands for Medellin's Punk Movement. It started in the mid-'80s, and I'm going to read an excerpt from David Bravo's book, Mala Hierba. Mala Hierba is like weed, basically, weeds, like the weeds in a garden. Well, I'm going to read an excerpt that describes how the first meetings of MPM developed. Since the mid-'80s, there have been collectives that start and then split throughout very short periods of time. The experience of MPM, Medellin's punk movement, as a self-managed collective in Castilla's punk enclave became a landmark. It was the start of a kind of youth autonomy building that departed from music. By mid-1985, any given Friday, on a peaceful night, a rumble was started by Suso, a punk from Castilla. He was another instigator and advocate of that moment. He grabbed the bullhorn and started calling out a meeting in a shed located by the 12 de Octubre neighborhood soccer field. On that starry night, different gangs, different galladas showed up on time, such as Los Porks, Los Dementes, Los Kenneys, Los Pigs, Los Nazis, Los Wasted, the Early Morticans, Los Demons, and some other punks. I'm using the pronunciation they would use back then because it was a curious thing. I mean, the action of naming their gangs was probably associated with the habit that they had found in movies such as Class of 1984 or such as The Warriors, which were very influential in the local scene. So that's why they sometimes try to imitate the English names of these gangs. But it was also very evident that English was not very widespread in the scene. People didn't frequently speak English, so they had this broken English when it came to naming the gangs and also when it came to learning the names of important groups. Two examples that could illustrate this is Stiff Like Finger was very important, it's Stiff Little Fingers, but here in the local scene the name was Stiff Like Finger, and that's how people learned them, that's how people learned to love them, and how people appropriated them. And the same thing happened with Minor Threat, which here in the local scene was called Minor Treat. In fact, there was an important market, La Plaza Minorista. Minorista in Spanish is retailers, it's a retailer's market, the biggest retailer's market in the city. But La Minorista was frequently referred to as La Minor Treat. Vamos pa la Minor Treat. So people would associate the local geography with this broken English that would bring the worldwide punk to our houses. Okay, so that was MPM, and those were the gangs that were popular back then. One important thing to mention at this moment is that by the end of the 1980s, the violence associated to the war between the state and Medellin cartel was growing. So basically, it was very difficult for gangs for galladas to hang out in the neighborhoods and in their usual territories. So they started migrating by the late 1980s. It was due to something called calentura, in a generic form here in the city. Calentura is like when the territories become too dangerous to inhabit them. So all these gangs started migrating, the people started going somewhere else, started hanging out at different places. The early gangs started disappearing, and new collectives started emerging around different activities such as starting bands, organizing concerts, publishing fanzines, and stuff like that. So those were like the characteristics that surrounded the scene at that moment. I'm talking about the late 1980s, 1989, more or less. And this was the reason why the scene had to change. There was a moment in those late 80s, a moment of organization, a new moment of organization. The first moment, MPM, had been centered on the needs that the new punks had at that moment. What were those needs? Finding places to play, finding instruments and technical supplies for starting their bands, finding rehearsal rooms, stuff like that. But then, in 1989, there were new needs. So a new initiative started. This new initiative was called OREC, It started in 1989. OREC stands for Organización Reacción en Cadena, Chain Reaction Organization. And it changed the face of the Punk Medallo scene. That is why we're going to leave that moment and that event as the starting point for our next episode in the alleyways in the Rotten City. Well, so today this is the end of our second episode of the alleyways in the Rotten City. Today we have discussed the emergence of the first Punk Medallo scene. We could call it a barrio scene because it was centered on those parches and those galladas that emerged from the different barrios in the city. The calentura, the situation of violence that involved different armed actors, that included the gangs in the popular neighborhoods, that included the state with the police and the army, but also included other actors. In this point, it's important to mention the militias, popular militias. At that moment, the popular militias were basically a development of the self-defense practices that the communities that had invaded the shanty towns had already developed. Many of them were associated to guerrillas, and they had been members of the guerrillas. But the militias as organizations did not depend, they were not subordinate to the guerrilla groups in the jungles of Colombia. Here, the guerrillas were basically a rural phenomenon, and the militias were the beginning of an urban situation that generated tensions between them. The militia groups were not supported at first by the organized guerrillas, and they were another armed actor in the territories. So you had them too, and you had the early paramilitaries that were associated with drug trafficking and with organized crimes. So all of these, the presence of all of these actors generated the calentura, made things really difficult in the neighborhoods. So all of these galladas started vanishing, the parches and the notas and all this culture, this underground culture from the 1980s started disappearing, and all these people started migrating. One important landmark in this process of migrations was the emergence of OREC, the Organización Reacción en Cadena, Chain Reaction Organization, which will be the starting point of our next episode in the alleyways in the Rotten City. See you around, guys.
En la época de nosotros, nos veníamos y nos coleábamos de noche para parcharnos aquí adentro y hacer los pogos. Y esto era lleno de momias. Y a las 5:30, 6 de la mañana cuando salíamos, aquí en la calle de Niquitao, habían 5, 6 muertos o hasta más. Parcero, era una gonorrea, uno tener que caminar como si los muertos fueran piedras, una gonorrea.
Callejones de la Ciudad Podrida, alleyways in the Rotten City. A journey along the living memory of Medellin punk scene, the Punk Medallo scene, and the local, national, and global context where it has developed. Our voice building up our memory.